The year was 1979. Deep in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, a conflict began that few in the West truly understood, a war that would stretch on for a decade, claiming countless lives and changing the course of history forever. This was not just a battle for territory. It was a clash of ideologies, a fierce struggle between a fading empire and fiercely independent tribes. The Soviet Union, then a superpower, sent its troops into Afghanistan with one goal: to support a communist government struggling to hold power against growing insurgency. What followed was a brutal and costly war, fought in some of the most unforgiving terrain on earth. The Afghan resistance, known as the mujahideen, used guerrilla tactics, intimate knowledge of their land, and relentless spirit to push back against the Soviet forces. But the real story, the human cost, the political blunders, and the lasting impact, has been buried in the shadows of history. This is the story of Russia's forgotten war in Afghanistan, a decade of pain, sacrifice, and consequences that shape the world we live in today. Stay with us as we uncover the untold truths behind the Soviet invasion, the resilience of the Afghan people, and the war that the world tried to forget. To understand the Soviet war in Afghanistan, we must first look at the political landscape of the late 1970s. Afghanistan was a kingdom ruled by King Zahir Shah for decades, maintaining a delicate balance between tradition and modernization. But beneath this fragile stability, unrest was brewing. In 1978, a coup known as the Sour Revolution brought a communist government, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, to power. This new regime aimed to transform Afghanistan through radical reforms, land redistribution, education changes, and women's rights, ideas that clashed deeply with the conservative Afghan society. The PDPA was also deeply divided internally, leading to brutal purges and infighting. Its policies alienated many tribal leaders, religious figures, and ordinary citizens. Resistance started to grow quickly, with widespread revolts erupting across the country. For the Soviet Union, Afghanistan was strategically critical. A friendly communist government on its southern border could strengthen its influence in the region and prevent Western powers from gaining ground. In December 1979, the Soviet Union launched a full-scale military intervention. Tens of thousands of Soviet troops crossed into Afghanistan. The official reason was to support the Afghan government against insurgents, but many historians argue the move was also driven by Cold War fears and a desire to protect Soviet interests. However, the Soviet military soon found itself trapped in a complex and brutal conflict. The mountainous terrain was unfamiliar and hostile. The Afghan fighters, later called mujahideen, knew every valley, mountain pass, and cave. Armed with basic weapons and a fierce determination, they launched ambushes and surprise attacks, disappearing into the mountains before Soviet forces could respond. The Soviets had superior firepower, tanks, and helicopters, but their heavy-handed tactics often alienated the local population further. What made the war even more complicated was international involvement. The United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and others covertly supported the mujahideen with weapons, training, and funding. The CIA's Operation Cyclone funneled billions of dollars worth of arms, including the now famous Stinger missiles that could take down Soviet helicopters. This external support dramatically changed the nature of the conflict, turning Afghanistan into a proxy battlefield of the Cold War superpowers. For the Soviet soldiers, the war was brutal and demoralizing. Many were young conscripts sent far from home to fight in a war they didn't fully understand. The fighting was relentless, the winters harsh, and the morale low. Casualties mounted. Estimates suggest that over 15,000 Soviet troops died, and tens of thousands were wounded. On the Afghan side, civilian deaths and suffering were devastating. Entire villages were destroyed, millions were displaced, and the country was torn apart by violence. Despite the Soviet Union's military strength, victory remained elusive. The war dragged on for nearly 10 years, becoming increasingly unpopular back home. Soviet society began to question the cost and purpose of the conflict, while Afghanistan remained divided and unstable. The human cost on both sides was tragic and far-reaching. By the late 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, recognized the war's futility. Under intense domestic pressure and changing global politics, the Soviet Union began withdrawing its forces in 1988, completing the pullout by February 1989. The war left Afghanistan deeply scarred and contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The legacy of the Soviet-Afghan War is complex and profound. It didn't just shape Afghanistan's future with civil wars and the Taliban, it also changed global politics in big ways. For Russia, it remains a painful chapter often overshadowed by other historical events. In this documentary, we will explore the stories of soldiers, civilians, and leaders caught in the turmoil. We will examine the strategic mistakes, heroic resistance, and tragic consequences of a war that changed history but was almost forgotten. The Soviet-Afghan War was not just a clash of armies but a deeply human tragedy that touched millions of lives. For the Afghan people, it was a nightmare of destruction, fear, and loss that reshaped their country forever. Villages turned to rubble, families torn apart, and generations scarred by violence. Yet amid this devastation, stories of courage, resilience, and defiance emerged. One of the defining features of the conflict was the guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the mujahideen fighters. They were ordinary Afghans, farmers, shepherds, and students, who took up arms to defend their homeland. Using hit-and-run attacks, booby traps, and ambushes, they made life unbearable for the Soviet soldiers. The mujahideen's deep knowledge of the mountainous terrain gave them an advantage that modern technology could not easily overcome. The terrain itself became a battlefield as harsh as the war. Afghanistan's rugged mountains, narrow valleys, and vast deserts offered the mujahideen natural cover and strategic strongholds. Soviet convoys and patrols were vulnerable to attacks from hidden positions in the hills. The harsh winters added another layer of suffering, as both soldiers and civilians struggled to survive freezing temperatures and shortages of food and medical supplies. Inside Afghanistan, ordinary civilians suffered most. The war caused one of the largest refugee crises of the late 20th century. Millions fled to neighboring Pakistan and Iran to escape the violence, living in overcrowded camps with little access to basic necessities. Those who remained often faced indiscriminate bombings and reprisals from both sides. Schools were closed, farms abandoned, and the economy collapsed. One haunting symbol of the war's human cost was the use of landmines. Millions of mines were scattered across the countryside by Soviet forces to deny mujahideen movement, but they remained lethal long after the war ended. Thousands of innocent Afghans, children, farmers, and nomads lost limbs or lives due to these hidden killers, a legacy that haunts Afghanistan to this day. The Soviet soldiers themselves were caught in a grim reality. Many wrote letters home expressing frustration, fear, and a longing for peace. Young conscripts faced guerrilla attacks, roadside bombs, and sniper fire with limited training and support. Their morale waned as the war stretched on, and stories of desertion and psychological trauma became common. Among the most intense battles was the Siege of Khost, lasting over a year, where mujahideen fighters surrounded a Soviet-held city, cutting supply lines and enduring heavy bombardments. Such battles showcased the stubborn determination on both sides but ended with devastating casualties. The war also had profound social impacts. The traditional Afghan way of life was disrupted. Tribal rivalries were inflamed, and the power of warlords increased. The social fabric of the country weakened as violence bred mistrust and chaos. Women, in particular, suffered from displacement and loss of access to education and health care. Internationally, the Soviet war in Afghanistan became a symbol of Cold War tensions. The United States saw an opportunity to weaken its rival and provided extensive support to the mujahideen through Pakistan AS intelligence services. Saudi Arabia and other countries also funneled money and weapons. This global involvement further intensified the conflict and laid the groundwork for future regional instability. Amid the conflict, some Afghan fighters became legendary. Figures like Ahmad Shah Massoud, known as the Lion of Panjshir, led fierce resistance and became symbols of hope. His tactical brilliance and dedication inspired many, even though his life ended tragically years later. The war also witnessed moments of great tragedy and controversy. The Soviet forces often used heavy air power and artillery to try to crush resistance, leading to civilian casualties and accusations of war crimes. Afghan cultural sites, homes, and infrastructure suffered immense damage. The human toll extended far beyond the battlefield. Despite the suffering, the Afghan people's spirit of resistance endured. The war galvanized a sense of national identity and struggle against foreign invasion. This resilience would continue to shape Afghanistan's future conflicts and its place on the world stage. As the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989, Afghanistan was left in ruins, politically fractured, economically devastated, and socially torn. The power vacuum led to a brutal civil war, from which emerged the Taliban, shaping decades of further conflict and hardship. In telling these stories, we remember not only the politics and military strategies, but the human cost, the lives disrupted, the families shattered, and the courage shown by those who lived through one of the 20th century's most brutal wars. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 marked the end of a decade-long conflict, but it was far from the end of Afghanistan's suffering. The war left the country politically fragmented and socially devastated, with millions displaced and infrastructure in ruins. What followed was a brutal civil war between competing factions of the mujahideen, each vying for control of the shattered nation. The fragile unity that had helped resist the Soviet invasion quickly fractured. Warlords and militias carved out territories and the violence escalated, plunging Afghanistan into chaos. The capital, Kabul, became a battleground, with artillery shelling reducing large parts of the city to rubble. The humanitarian crisis deepened, with starvation, disease, and poverty overwhelming the population. Amid this turmoil, a new force emerged: the Taliban. Rising from the southern province of Kandahar in the early 1990s, the Taliban promised stability through strict Islamic law. Their rapid advance captured much of Afghanistan by the mid-1990s. However, their harsh rule, suppression of women, and use of violence sparked international condemnation. The war's consequences rippled far beyond Afghanistan's borders. For the Soviet Union, the Afghan War became known as the Vietnam of the USSR, a costly and demoralizing conflict that contributed to the erosion of Soviet power. The war exposed weaknesses in the Soviet military and economy, draining resources at a time when reform was desperately needed. In 1991, just 2 years after the withdrawal, the Soviet Union collapsed, ending the Cold War era. Many analysts argue that the protracted Afghan war played a significant role in hastening this historic collapse. For the United States and its allies, the conflict was seen as a Cold War victory. Supporting the mujahideen had helped bleed the Soviet Union and shift the balance of power. But this short-term success came with long-term consequences. Among those who fought against the Soviets were foreign fighters from across the Muslim world, united by ideology and jihad. Some of these fighters would later form extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda, which would bring violence and terror to a global scale. The unstable post-war Afghanistan became a breeding ground for terrorism and regional conflict, leading eventually to the U.S. invasion in 2001 after the September 11 attacks. The legacy of the Soviet-Afghan War is complex and cautionary. It illustrates how foreign intervention, even with overwhelming military force, can become entangled in local dynamics and lead to unintended consequences. The war devastated Afghanistan's people and landscape, leaving wounds that are still healing today. Russia itself has revisited its Afghan experience with a mixture of reflection and regret. Veterans of the war remember their comrades lost and the futility of a conflict that many felt was imposed from above. The war has shaped Russia's military doctrine and approach to foreign policy ever since. For Afghanistan, the decades of war shattered centuries-old social structures, caused mass displacement, and challenged the very idea of national unity. Yet amid the hardship, Afghan culture, resilience, and spirit persist, continuing to inspire hope for peace and rebuilding. The Soviet war in Afghanistan remains a story rarely told in full, overshadowed by later conflicts and political shifts. But understanding this forgotten war is essential to grasping the modern history of Central Asia, the Cold War's final chapters, and the ongoing struggles that define Afghanistan today. As we look back on this decade of conflict, we remember the human faces behind the headlines, the soldiers, civilians, families, and fighters caught in the crossfire. Their stories remind us of the high price of war and the enduring hope for peace.